Hello everyone and welcome to a special cyber insurance edition of Insurance Business TV, brought to you by Tokyo Marine HCC Cyber and Professional Lines Group. I'm IB's managing editor, Paul Lucas, and in this edition, we'll be bringing you a virtual roundtable featuring some of the leading names in the cyber space to examine issues such as ransomware, the recent SolarWinds hack, COVID-19, and the best prevention methods available. You could say we're going to bring you the inside hacks to succeed in this space. So who are our experts? They are Ari Giller, the Vice President of Cyber and Tech Underwriting at Tokyo Marine HCC Cyber and Professional Lines Group. Matt Shanks, who is the Executive Vice President at Lanta, Financial Lines Practice Leader at Amwins Group. And Charlie Groves, the Global Senior Director of Business Development Services at CrowdStrike. So gentlemen, when we're talking cyber, there really is only one place to start, that of course being ransomware. It is expected that the rapid growth of ransomware will continue well into the future. So tell me, how are insurers reacting to this challenge and addressing what is becoming a rapidly expanding threat? Ari, how about you kick things off?
The cyber market is in a tumultuous state right now. Carrier response is varied, with markets taking a blended approach of rate increase and coverage reduction. It's estimated that 2021 carriers will be increasing premiums on an average of 35 to 40%, and that may even be more on an account-by-account basis. Carriers are enforcing cyber extortion sublimits and even total ransomware claim sublimits, where forensic, legal, notification costs, third-party claims, business interruption, and ransomware payments stemming from the ransomware attack are all tied to one sublimit. I've also seen co-insurances of up to 75% on those sublimits. And I guess overall, just stricter underwriting guidelines. There's a more intensive underwriting process to verify ransomware controls, and that's complicated by carriers asking different questions and requesting different supplements to be completed. It's probably driving Matt crazy. But fortunately, there is some multilateral agreement that multi-factor authentication is an important control. We've seen carriers be a little bit more careful in limit management. I've seen an overall reduction of limit at renewals depending on class, revenues, or controls. And I've seen one major carrier's appetite for 10 mil capacity become almost non-existent. So rate increase and coverage reduction are short-term solutions. TMHCC's long-term goal is to raise the awareness of ransomware and security posture. I've participated on calls and on-site underwriting visits for large enterprises, but their budget for IT security is minimal. So it really highlights the disparity between what's been going on and how prepared our insureds are for this ransomware issue. So we see prevention as the best cure. We want to reduce the costs by avoiding catastrophic events in the first place. And part of that, how we do that, is prioritizing partnerships between us and the insureds and being more proactive in risk management. The goal is for them to see us as a partner in the risk management process rather than a risk transfer solution.
And Matt, Ari there said that this situation's got to be driving you crazy. Tell us what it means to be a broker with all this right now.
So I would agree with everything Ari said. This market has been nuts. I mean, honestly, I would say it's needed. Cyber over the past years, rates have just plummeted. Coverage kept getting broader and broader on a monthly basis. New carriers would emerge, add additional enhancements, and ultimately, this had to catch up to the market eventually. Ransomware is the key piece driving all these changes. So I can't say it's the same for all markets. You have some of the emerging leaders that come in and they're the first ones changing the market. This all started with ransomware apps, which of course now I think is almost adopted by all markets across the board. The key on these is getting ahead of all your renewals, similar to Ari said, get out early and get this information. But a lot of it comes down to the controls. So we are seeing those rate increases that Ari mentioned. I would see we're seeing the most significant increases on those classes of business that were historically underpriced, be it manufacturing, construction, A&E, classes that historically the cyber markets were pricing purely just based off high revenue, and you had a very low premium. And we're seeing 100, 200, 300% on those underpriced risks, where larger enterprises, typically with some sort of, even if it's a tech E&O combination or larger enterprises with heavy cybersecurity, we are still seeing those 15, 20, 30% increases across the board. Those coverage restrictions in terms of limits are real. So every single deal we have coming up on renewal or having to market, and a lot of it's driven by ransomware. The ransomware demands historically, we would see 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, even 100,000 on average. That was okay. I think the big thing now in the ransomware space with the insurance market is $1 million demands, $3 million demands, $5 million demands. Even recently, there's $50 million plus demands that we're now seeing, I would say, fairly frequent, which has created an issue because these threat actors know what to ask for. And I can't say it's all tied to insurance policies paying these numbers, but I do think, one, cyber criminals know how to ask for this and they know that policies are responding. But that's been the big change. And there's cyber markets that are stepping up from either a co-insurance standpoint or higher retentions. We have some markets requiring MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. And the earlier we can get ahead of all these items, I think the easier the renewal process will be. But it all comes down to controls. So, similar to what Ari said, it's going to come down to getting ahead of these, having the proper controls in place. And that's why I think it's important to have strong insurance carrier partners that have strong vendor contacts and or strong pre-breach services to offer to the insured. So,
and Ari, Matt mentioned there about the soaring ransom demands. And of course, there have been calls in some jurisdictions to potentially ban the payment of ransoms. Where do you stand on that?
Just as a regulatory disclaimer, Team HTC regularly reviews compliance with OFAC regulations, and we review procedures and protocols of our vendors to prevent transacting business with prohibited entities. But onto the question, we see us as providing an essential service for small to middle market enterprises. By eliminating the payment of ransoms, it would severely jeopardize the financial health of a small business owner for both insureds and self-insureds. Politics aside, the banning of products and services has yielded limited results and success in history, and attempts to do so have turned people to dark markets.
Of course, while ransomware has been grabbing headlines generally, one of the most high-profile cyber attacks of recent times was the SolarWinds hack. Charlie, if I can come to you, tell us what happened and why it was so important.
Happy to participate here. SolarWinds is a really, really interesting and important breach with far-reaching implications. It kind of takes us a little bit off topic from ransomware and really focuses in on some nation state actors. So to lay a little bit of groundwork, who is SolarWinds? Well, it's a company with tens of thousands of clients, and they offer up a network management suite called Orion. And just like many applications, they update the platform with various updates through patches. That might be functionality, could be security, or whatever have you. Well, over a year ago, SolarWinds was breached by who we believe to be a nation-state Russian actor. We don't have 100% confidence in attribution today, but there are allegations out there that it might be Cozy Bear, which some may know as APT29. Right now, we are tracking it as under a different name called Stellar Particle until we have 100% attribution there. This is a really, really sophisticated adversary. I mean, you're talking true nation state, government backed, armed with all of the best tooling. Once they got into SolarWinds, what they did is they created a malware to mirror the Oracle software. So it was all developed in the same type of code, which is Microsoft.NET. They had this very similar naming convention so that it would go undetected. And then when SolarWinds pushed a release, it infected all of those companies that downloaded that patch. And so about 18,000 individual companies did the download. So kind of interesting here, those people that were keeping up with regular patch management actually were penalized. It's just sort of the irony of the SolarWinds breach, which is really unfortunate. Of those, even though it was really widespread, it was also then became a very targeted campaign. So they were looping back around. What the malware did, it dropped a DLL, so a library of files, and then they were executed to create command and control communication. So once that C2 communication was established, then they were able to download additional tooling, one of which was to scan to look at what other security products were running and actually shut down those security products. Then they did a reboot, reestablished command and control, and were able to come back in with full administrative access. They were even able to migrate into the Microsoft Azure environments, the cloud-based environments. So it has a lot of implications here. Number one, it was delivered by a very trusted source, so a supply chain attack. So when we think about all of the people and companies that our firms interact with, you now have to be very, very careful. Even though it might be a trusted source, how can we rely on what's being received by that particular vendor? So that was there's a lot of implications there. Obviously, how widespread it was is really important, but also then who did they go after? Really sophisticated entities. These aren't mom and pop shops that haven't paid attention to security. We're talking about US government agencies. You're talking about very sophisticated cybersecurity companies, telecom companies. So they were certainly playing with the big boys. And it really goes to show you the sophistication of these adversaries, right? They're going up with some of the toughest internal security teams that are supported by external resources, and they are still able to breach them. So a lot of very interesting things to continue to watch as we learn more and more about that adversary and that particular breach.
Ari, tell us a little bit about how carriers have responded to this.
On the carrier side, we've always been wary of aggregation exposure. Historically, we've always wondered, okay, what would happen if Amazon Web Services went down and, thousands of our insureds have, storing data with this cloud provider, what does that mean for us? And, the SolarWinds Orion hack, it sort of just highlights how changing and fast-paced the exposure is typically evolving. Now, in response to SolarWinds, we're seeing carriers underwrite for this event by asking about the utilization of SolarWinds and excluding claims arising from the hack where necessary. It is funny, or I guess somewhat ironic that, and Charlie brought this up, it's somewhat problematic that, the people or the insureds who were up to date on their patch management services were actually the ones that got hit with this.
Incredible situation. And of course, it's believed that on the back of the SolarWinds hack, that companies are turning to a new method of assuming there are already breaches rather than reacting to them after they are found. Charlie, tell us a little bit about how this works and its repercussions.
So first of all, hopefully most companies didn't start looking proactively at how they're going to prevent breaches and waiting until the SolarWinds event happened. I think it's just a really good reminder of that's essential in any security program. And I think there's a few components here that are somewhat unique to the sophisticated adversaries that were involved in SolarWinds. So first of all, it's critical that an organization has visibility across all workloads. So all endpoints, servers, cloud workloads, et cetera. You really need to have that visibility across everything within your environment. And then kind of combining threat intelligence with managed threat hunting. So obviously, this adversary went to great lengths to remain stealth and stay under the radar. So how do you detect that? It's a huge challenge here for organizations of any sophistication. And it's really combining that threat intel to be able to start to anticipate what are these adversaries doing? What is their next TTPs or techniques, tactics, and procedures? How do we prevent it? Then having expert managed threat hunters that are looking within that environment to look for that activity. So you might see an IOC out there in the wild, and those threat hunters need to look internally at the environment to see, is there any of that type of activity going on? So there's a lot of challenges here. There's a lot of zero trust implications, and that applies to all sorts of different kinds of breaches. But really, the concept of least privilege, which means why would you be accessing certain assets, and then obviously identifying those assets that are so critical to the organization, and that there's extra layers of protection that are put around that area of the network.
Ari, if I can come to you, I mean, perhaps there's been a plus here in the sense that there is maybe increased awareness around IT security.
I'm actually all in favor for this shift. As you said, there is an increased awareness surrounding cybersecurity. And what we're really looking is for our insurers and just American companies in general to take a more proactive approach in managing their risk and tightening their IT security.
We've talked about ransomware, we've talked about SolarWinds, but we can't talk about cyber insurance without looking at the impact of the past year, a year which has really thrown the whole cyber issue into the mainstream spotlight. Tell us how COVID-19 has accelerated vulnerabilities and what are the new issues that have emerged? Matt, I imagine a lot of this revolves around the uptick in remote work.
Yeah, so it's funny. It's a trick question too. I think we would have seen a huge uptick even without COVID. I think the ransomware demands and just the momentum that threat actors have had would have probably happened regardless. Now, I do think COVID helped pour gasoline on the fire, right? So you send employees home, you have BYOD, so bring your own devices. You have a lot of companies that weren't prepared for a work from home environment. So, some companies had work from home environments, some didn't. A lot were just not ready for, hey, we're about to send 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 employees home. They might not have proper multi-factor authentication and controls to access the servers. And so I do think this was a chance where a lot of these threat actors said, hey, this is a huge uptick, right? We're going to go after all these individuals that are now working from home. We know their personal devices don't have proper controls. We know not all companies have multi-factor authentication. So I do see COVID-19 as, it really sped up the environment as it relates to attacks, especially ransomware attacks, back to question number one. But yeah, that's something I saw happening in the market regardless. So I think COVID-19, it just helped round out and speed up the process. But again, it all kind of comes back to controls in that pre-breach to scenario of IT security before the actual breach happens. So I just want to wrap up there and say COVID-19 was something that helped speed up the environment.
And Charlie, I guess you've seen some interesting data around this.
I agree with Matt's observations that, number one, we've seen an incredible evolution in the sophistication of e-crime actors. So the tooling that they have available to them, it's also around specialization. So we're seeing certain actors that focus on getting access. Others can then come in and encrypt. And so you're seeing a lot of collaboration among these actors. What COVID did, it created, number one, new vulnerabilities, but also a new platform to be able to exploit the vulnerable. So vulnerabilities, Matt, you did a great job of covering them. Can you imagine that now you're trying to do all the things that you would normally do, but you have a 100% remote workforce? It's really tough. Companies we saw struggling even doing patching because they didn't have the bandwidth to even get patches out to their end users. Can you imagine the SOC team who's responsible for keeping eyes on the glass and making sure that there's nobody in the environment is now displaced and working out of their homes without the normal tools that they have? So ton of reasons, like as you were, VPNs are starting to be rolled out, remote desktop protocols, none of which some of these organizations have ever configured. So all of that led to a ton of vulnerability. But let's not forget, one of the main ways that they were getting in is still old school phishing. And so it's really tough to continue to train your organizations on that. And that's really what I mean by it provided a new platform, right? So if we can remember back a year ago, think how many emails you were getting related to COVID that could very well be legitimate. It could be about your school, your